Tomorrow is International Women's Day, and new research is painting a sobering picture on the impact of family violence on wāhine. More than half of New Zealand women have experienced violence or abuse by an intimate partner, which then increases the risk of developing a mental health disorder or other chronic physical illness in their lifetime. Tracy McIntosh no Ngai Tūhoe is a professor of Indigenous Studies and co-head of Te Wānanga o Waipapa at the University of Auckland. She's also co-authored the 2019 New Zealand Family Violence Study, He Koe Ora Mata Popore, and she's with us now. Tēnā koe, Professor McIntosh. Thank you for joining us. Now, the report found domestic violence increases the risk of developing a mental health disorder by almost 3 times and a chronic physical illness almost double. How can domestic violence have this kind of impact on wāhine?
Well, I think it's really what's so important about this report. It's the first time we've been able to demonstrate that intimate partner violence has this really significant link to poor health outcomes. And I think when you think about it, particularly for those that have had more than 1, 2, 3, so we're looking at physical violence, we're looking at psychological violence, we're looking at economic violence, we're looking at coercive control. The more that a woman experiences those forms, the more likely she's going to have an adverse health effect. Some of that can be related to, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Some of that is just around toxic environments, the high levels of stress. All of those we know have an impact on health. And so here we're able to really demonstrate that very significant link.
So with so much disruption in the world, including COVID lockdowns and increasing financial pressures, is it clear that these problems are only worsening?
Well, it's a really interesting thing. This study is a life course study, so it looks at prevalence. So we interviewed about 1,400 women, we interviewed about 1,300 men, and these are very long form interviews. And really when we look at that and we compare it with data that we've already got, we actually see that the actual experience of intimate partner violence has remained relatively static, but way too high, 1 out of 3
Sure.
women. And we are actually seeing some areas where we might actually be seeing some level of decline. But we are seeing certain things like in economic violence, coercive control, we're seeing some increases. What we do know, that as a country, it is far too high. So we must always treat this with real urgency.
Yeah, it's way too high. It's awful. So do you believe that family violence needs to be recognised as, say, a health issue and thereby potentially receiving more support along with other health issues?
I mean, it's really clear with this report that we're actually able to demonstrate that. So it must be seen as a health issue. And that means we sort of really think about, the ways that we need to change the system to recognise, yes, this is a social issue. Yes, this is a community issue. For us as whānau Māori, it's our issue as well. But without a doubt, it's a health issue. And so we need to ensure then we have a far more cohesive and coherent approach.
Tracy, what sort of strategies do you think would best counter any violence against wāhine, let alone intimate partner violence?
It's an all of community response. We know that our responses as Māori, particularly for Māori, must be Māori responses. They must be culturally informed, they must be by and for Māori, and they must work much more collectively. If we only worked with wāhine Māori, we're not going to change this impact. We might change the lives of individuals, but we won't change the collective. So we must work with wāhine Māori, with tāne, with our tamariki. And we also have to have responses that do not continue to just criminalise or just pathologise these issues. We have to look at really healthy relationships, what we need to support and uplift whānau. One of the really knowing element, or one of the sort of, again, shocking elements of this research is those that are likely to have, or wāhine Māori who are most likely to have the most adverse health impacts, that they also experience high levels of food insecurity, just not enough for the whānau. So these things are really linked. So the healthcare element and embedding that in our health system, seeing intimate partner violence as a social indicator of health is critical. But the broader response, that much more sort of whānau order response, that's an ongoing one, and all of us must have a commitment to that.
Well, we know that physical and sexual violence hurts people immensely and very often with far-reaching consequences into another generation. What are the report's recommendations?
I mean, the report's recommendations are broad and in many ways drawing on other elements. We have, particularly in regards to looking at the way of embedding it within healthcare, ensuring in the same way that that a health professional might inquire around smoking, around alcohol use, that this becomes an important part. Now, that's a lot of capacity and capability building. You've got to really develop spaces of trust when you're able to be able to talk more openly about that, and particularly ensuring that the response will be one of support and that will be culturally informed. So those are big things. The other elements is around healthy relationships. Really important to look at, even within our educational curriculum, around the way we talk about relationships between people, the way that power is exercised, that this issue around economic violence or coercive control, particularly coercive control, that's what we call the golden thread. It's the golden thread through all forms of violence. That speaks to power relationships. We need to look at how do we have healthy relationships with each other.
Professor of Indigenous Studies and co-head of Te Wānanga o Waipapa at the University of Auckland, Tracy McIntosh. Thank you so much for your time today and for your mahi. This is incredibly important mahi. Ngā mihi.
Ngā mihi.